Chapter 1. The Stain on page 47. Rain hammered against the tall, arched windows of the Blackwood Municipal Library. Each drop sounded like a tiny fist pounding glass, a frantic rhythm against the oppressive silence within. Eleanor Vance sat at the main circulation desk. The polished wood cool beneath her forearms. Outside, the October sky wept a uniform gray, mirroring the permanent weather inside her chest. 3:15. Another hour until Mrs. Peterson arrived for the evening shift. Another hour of sterile quiet punctuated only by the clock's heavy tick and the occasional rustle of a turning page from one of the library's few patrons. She traced the rim of her lukewarm mug of tea, the porcelain smooth, the liquid inside bitter. It had gone cold ages ago. Around her, shelves stretched into the dimness, rows upon rows of spines promising escape, knowledge, adventure, none of which held any appeal. Her own story, the one playing relentlessly behind her eyes, drowned them all out. Maya's laughter cut short. The dark, churning water. The splintered dock piling her own hand had slipped from. Guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, tightening her throat. Eleanor straightened a stack of returned novels, her movements precise, automatic. The familiar scent of aging paper, binding glue, and floor wax filled the air. It was a smell she once associated with comfort, with sanctuary. Now it simply smelled like Tuesday or Wednesday. The days bled together, marked only by the changing rota pinned inside the staff room door. A thick volume lay separate from the others, returned earlier by a student who vanished quickly into the rain. Sonnets of the Lost Sea, Maya's favorite. Eleanor's fingers hesitated above the worn leather cover, the gold leaf title faded but legible. She hadn't opened it since before. It felt like disturbing a grave. Yet something compelled her, a masochistic urge, a need to scrape the wound raw. She pulled the book closer, the leather cool against her skin. Slowly she opened it. The pages whispered, releasing a puff of dry, musty air. Her eyes scanned the familiar verses, poems Maya could recite from memory, poems that spoke of longing, storms, and depths unseen. Eleanor's breath hitched. She remembered Maya reading aloud, her voice bright, animated, perched on the edge of Eleanor's bed, long after lights out. A phantom ache resonated deep in her bones. Her fingers brushed against something stiff between pages 46 and 47. Not a bookmark. Too thick, too rigid. Curiosity, a rare flicker in the gray fog of her apathy, prompted her to investigate. She carefully separated the pages. Nestled within the poem titled, "The Undertow's Call," lay a ticket. It wasn't modern cardstock. It felt strangely heavy, almost like thin, stiff leather or compressed parchment, cool to the touch. The color was a deep, unsettling indigo, bordering on black, with silver lettering that seemed to shimmer faintly even in the library's dim light. It was longer and narrower than any train or bus ticket she had ever encountered. One way. The words were stark, embossed in that silvery script. Below them, smaller text read, "Issued by the Penumbral Transit Authority. Destination, the other side. Valid upon presentation, at the designated confluence. Time 11th hour, place, where iron sleeps." Eleanor stared. Penumbral Transit Authority, designated confluence. Where iron sleeps. It sounded like nonsense, a joke, An elaborate piece of found art left by the student, but the quality, the strange material, the unsettling weight, the way the silver lettering caught the light. It didn't seem like a prank. It felt old, purposeful. Her gaze fixed on destination, the other side. A cold dread mixed with a sudden, unwanted surge of something else. Not quite hope that felt too sharp, too bright for the dull landscape of her grief. It was darker, more insidious. A desperate yearning. The phrase echoed the euphemisms people used after Maya, passed over, gone to the other side. Her rational mind screamed hoax. It was paper, ink, misplaced sentimentality. Yet her grief-stricken core whispered differently. What if? The question was absurd, poisonous, but it took root instantly. What if it wasn't a joke? What if this impossible object offered an impossible chance? A chance to, what? See Maya again, apologize, understand why a bright, laughing girl who loved poetry about the sea had been swallowed by it. She traced the words where iron sleeps, an old phrase. It usually meant a scrapyard or perhaps an abandoned railway line. There was one such place on the edge of Blackwood, overgrown, unused for decades. The old northern spur line near the disused foundry, where iron slept. The 11th hour, 11 p.m. Her heart began a heavy, uneven beat against her ribs. This was madness, grief-induced delusion. She should throw it away, dismiss it as a strange piece of litter. But her fingers wouldn't release the ticket. It felt strangely warm now, or perhaps her own skin was cold. The silver script seemed to pulse faintly. Maya. The name was a silent scream in her mind. The image of her sister's face, eyes wide with shock as the water closed over her head, flashed sharp and clear. The weight on Eleanor's shoulders intensified. Years of therapy, support groups, medication. Nothing had dulled the edge of that memory, the crushing certainty of her own failure. If there was a sliver, a molecule of a chance to undo that moment, to speak to Maya one last time, wasn't any risk worth taking, even the risk of utter insanity. She glanced at the library clock. 4:30. Hours stretched before 11. Hours to reconsider, to regain sanity. Or hours for the desperate, irrational seed planted by the ticket to grow into an unshakable resolve. Eleanor carefully slid the indigo ticket into her coat pocket. It felt heavy there, a physical manifestation of the choice coiling within her. She finished her shift in a daze, processing books, answering mundane questions from patrons. The strange ticket a secret anchor pulling her towards the 11th hour. Mrs. Peterson arrived, bustling and cheerful, oblivious to the turmoil beneath Eleanor's carefully maintained calm. "Quiet night, Ellie?" Mrs. Peterson asked, hanging her coat. "Very," Eleanor managed, her voice sounding distant even to her own ears. "Just the usual." She walked home through the relentless rain, streetlights casting distorted halos on the wet pavement. Her small apartment felt emptier than usual, the silence pressing in. She didn't eat. She sat on her worn sofa, the indigo ticket resting on the cushion beside her, its silver letters gleaming faintly in the gloom. Doubt gnawed at her, reason pleaded, but the raw, gaping wound of Maya's absence was a stronger force. What was left to lose? As 10:30 approached, she stood. She pulled on her heaviest raincoat, the one Maya used to borrow. She didn't check her reflection. She slipped the ticket into her pocket, the stiff material a tangible link to this insane endeavor. The walk to the edge of town was long, the rain finally easing to a miserable drizzle. Streetlights grew scarcer, paved roads gave way to cracked asphalt, then gravel. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of damp earth and rust. Ahead, silhouetted against the slightly less dark sky, loomed the skeletal remains of the old foundry, its chimneys like accusing fingers. Beside it, half swallowed by weeds and encroaching woods, lay the abandoned northern spur line. Weeds pushed through cracked concrete sleepers. Rails, thick with rust, curved away into darkness. No station building remained, just a crumbling concrete platform barely visible beneath tangled vines and years of neglect. This was it, where iron slept. Eleanor stood on the edge of the derelict platform, the silence profound, broken only by the dripping of water from unseen foliage and the distant hum of the town she had left behind. Doubt surged again, cold and sharp. This was foolish, pathetic. Standing in a muddy field, clutching a nonsensical ticket, chasing ghosts. She should turn around, go home, try to sleep. Then a change occurred. The air grew heavy, charged, the way it does before a thunderstorm but without the wind. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the soles of her worn boots, coming not from the town but from the tracks themselves. A low, rhythmic pulse, like a colossal, sleeping heartbeat. Further down the line, where the tracks vanished into blackness, a pinprick of light appeared. Not the bright, searching beam of a modern train. This was a sickly yellow glow, weak and ancient like gaslight seen through thick fog. It grew steadily, accompanied by a sound that wasn't the roar of a diesel engine or the hiss of steam, but something else entirely. A slow, grinding, metallic groan, overlaid with a faint, multi-toned whispering, like wind through broken teeth. Panic seized Eleanor. Her instinct screamed, "Run!" This wasn't right. This wasn't possible. But her feet felt rooted to the crumbling concrete. The ticket in her pocket seemed to thrum in time with the approaching engine. Slowly, impossibly, a train slid out of the darkness. It was black, matte black, absorbing the meager light. Its shape was archaic, Victorian perhaps, but distorted, elongated with sharp angles where curves should be. No steam billowed, yet a cold mist clung to its undercarriage, swirling around the massive, rust-pitted wheels that turned with agonizing slowness. The single yellow headlamp cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe independently. Carriages followed, their windows dark, reflecting nothing, like eyes staring blankly into the night. The train ground to a halt directly in front of her section of the platform. The rhythmic pulsing stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence, deeper than the earlier quiet. The whispering sound persisted, seeming to emanate from the very metal of the train. With a sound like stone grinding on stone, a single door slid open in the carriage before her. The interior was swallowed in shadow, impenetrable. No steps descended. There was just the opening, a void waiting. Eleanor stood frozen, her breath trapped in her lungs. Her hand tightened around the indigo ticket in her pocket. This was it. The confluence, the 11th hour. From the darkness within the carriage doorway, a figure emerged. Tall, impossibly gaunt, dressed in the rotting remnants of a conductor's uniform glistening with perpetual dampness. Where his face should have been, there was only a swirling vortex of deeper shadow beneath the brim of his cap. Skeletal fingers, bone white against the decaying fabric, extended a hand, palm up, not beckoning, waiting. Mordecai Grimstone. The name surfaced in her mind, unbidden, unwanted, yet certain. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Run. Go home. This is wrong. But Maya's face flashed again, pleading, lost. The weight of years of silence, of words unsaid, pressed down. Her hand trembled as she pulled the indigo ticket from her pocket. The silver lettering seemed to burn cold against her skin. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. The swirling void beneath the conductor's cap seemed to watch her, judge her. She placed the ticket onto the outstretched skeletal palm. The moment it left her grasp, a profound coldness shot up her arm, settling deep within her chest. The conductor's fingers closed around the ticket. A faint click echoed, sharp and final, like a lock engaging. He retracted his hand into the shadows. He didn't speak. He didn't move aside. The doorway remained open, an invitation into absolute darkness. Eleanor hesitated for one last, agonizing second. Then, steeling herself against the icy dread flooding her veins, she stepped across the threshold, leaving the crumbling platform, the drizzling rain, and the world she knew behind. The heavy door slid shut with a deafening, resonant boom that vibrated through the carriage floor. Plunged into near-total darkness, Eleanor was alone. The train began to move, not with a jolt, but with a smooth, sickening glide, pulling away from the sleeping iron, accelerating into the night towards its impossible destination. The journey had begun. Chapter 2. The Cold Between Breaths. Darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating, the moment the door boomed shut. Eleanor stumbled forward, arms outstretched, hitting the plush, yielding surface of a seat. The air was cold, unnaturally still, carrying a faint metallic tang beneath layers of dust and something else. A cloying sweetness like overripe fruit left to decay. The smooth, sickening glide of the train's movement was barely perceptible, yet profoundly unsettling. No rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails, just a low, continuous hum that seemed to vibrate deep within her bones, resonating in her teeth. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up her throat. She spun around, hands searching for the door, finding only smooth, cold metal paneling where it had been. No handle, no seam, no way back. Trapped. The word echoed in the sudden, roaring silence of her own mind. She banged a fist against the metal, the sound absorbed instantly, leaving no echo. It was like hitting solid lead. "Hello," her voice was a pathetic croak, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. "Is anyone there?" Only the low hum answered, a sound that felt less auditory and more like a pressure change within her skull. She took a ragged breath, trying to quell the rising tide of hysteria. Think. She needed to think. She was on a train, an impossible train, heading towards an impossible destination. Panicking wouldn't change that. It would only make her vulnerable. To what she didn't dare speculate. Slowly her eyes began to adjust, or perhaps the darkness itself thinned slightly. Shapes emerged from the blackness, vague outlines resolving into rows of seats lining a long, narrow carriage. The upholstery looked like velvet, deep crimson or possibly black, impossible to tell for certain in the gloom. The windows were tall rectangles of absolute blackness, reflecting nothing, not even her own indistinct form. They didn't seem like glass, more like polished obsidian surfaces drinking the faint light. A faint, flickering illumination began to emanate from fixtures overhead. Not electric bulbs, but small glass spheres containing a swirling, phosphorescent gas, casting a weak, sickly yellow-green light that pulsed irregularly. The light was just strong enough to reveal the carriage's true state. Dust lay thick on every surface, disturbed in swirling patterns by unseen currents. The velvet seats were ripped in places, horsehair stuffing spilling out like dried entrails. The metal fittings, luggage racks, window frames were tarnished and pitted, streaked with rust that seemed too dark, almost black. And the smell, the sweetness intensified under the flickering light, now identifiable as the scent of wilting flowers, lilies perhaps, mingled with the sharp odor of ozone and damp wool. It was the smell of a neglected funeral parlor. She wasn't alone. Across the aisle, slumped against a window, sat a figure, motionless. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The figure was bundled in heavy, dark clothing, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, obscuring its face entirely. Man or woman, it was impossible to tell. It didn't move, didn't breathe as far as Eleanor could discern. Was it dead, asleep? Just another phantom passenger on this spectral express. Further down the carriage, other shapes occupied seats. Huddled figures, indistinct forms half hidden in shadow, all utterly still. None seemed to acknowledge her presence or the train's movement. They were like statues draped in old clothes, forgotten props on a decaying stage set. The silence from them was absolute, more profound than mere quiet. It felt like a deliberate absence of sound. Eleanor sank cautiously onto the edge of a seat near the sealed door, the worn velvet surprisingly cold beneath her hand. The train glided onward, its movement unnervingly smooth. She strained her ears, listening past the internal hum. Faint whispers seemed to coil just at the edge of hearing, too indistinct to form words, like secrets shared in the space between breaths. Were they coming from the other passengers, from the walls, or only from inside her own head? She risked a glance towards the nearest window, still black, utterly devoid of reflection or exterior view. It was like staring into a void. Did the train even move through a physical space? Or was this journey internal, metaphorical? The ticket hadn't specified. The other side. Vague, terrifyingly vague. A sudden, sharp click echoed from the front of the carriage. Eleanor flinched, her head snapping up. Nothing changed. The seated figures remained immobile. The sickly light pulsed. Had she imagined it? No, there it was again. Click. Like a metal latch engaging. Or like the conductor punching a ticket. Mordecai Grimstone. Where was he? Patrolling the aisles, lurking in the shadows between carriages. The image of his skeletal hand closing over her ticket sent a fresh wave of cold dread through her. What had she paid? What was the true fare for this journey? The ticket stated one way, but offered no terms, no conditions. She hugged herself, trying to generate some warmth, chafing her arms through the damp fabric of her coat. The cold in the carriage wasn't just a lack of heat. It felt active, invasive. It seeped into her bones, carrying with it the pervasive sense of decay and sorrow that permeated the air. Time stretched, became meaningless. Minutes could have been hours. The train hummed onward, the landscape outside the windows remaining an impenetrable black. Eleanor's initial panic subsided into a gnawing anxiety, a constant, low-level thrum of fear that resonated with the train's own vibration. Her thoughts kept circling back to Maya, to the dock, the water, the scream caught in her throat. Was this journey a punishment, a twisted form of atonement? She noticed movement, not from the slumped figures but from the air itself. Near the ceiling, where the shadows were thickest, the dust motes seemed to coalesce, swirling in slow, deliberate patterns unsupported by any draft. They formed intricate, shifting lines almost like threads, black threads glistening faintly, weaving themselves into complex, web-like structures in the upper corners of the carriage. Eleanor watched, mesmerized and horrified. The patterns shifted, resolved, and for a heart-stopping moment, she saw an image coalesce within the swirling dust and shadow threads. A flash of dark water, a small hand reaching, grasping. Maya's face, wide-eyed just below the surface. She gasped, stumbling back against her seat, the image vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. Hallucination, the air, the stress, the grief. Or was it something else, something deliberate? She scanned the carriage again, her eyes darting towards the corners where the threads had formed. The dust hung limp now, inert, but the feeling of being watched intensified, prickling the back of her neck. It was then she saw the girl. She hadn't been there moments before, standing silently in the aisle, halfway down the carriage, partially obscured by a seat back, small, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing a simple, pale dress that seemed oddly luminous in the gloom. Her hair was dark, plastered to her forehead as if damp. Her skin was unnervingly pale, almost translucent. She wasn't looking at Eleanor, but towards one of the black windows, her head tilted slightly as if listening intently. Eleanor's breath caught. There was something achingly familiar about the set of the girl's shoulders, the way she held her head. A phantom echo of Maya at that age. But this child radiated a coldness that surpassed even the carriage's chill. It was the cold of the grave. "Hello," Eleanor whispered again, the word barely audible. The girl didn't turn. She remained utterly still, facing the void-like window. Then slowly, deliberately, she began to hum. A simple tune, a nursery rhyme but dissonant, slightly off-key, the notes bending in ways that scraped against the nerves. It was a sound both innocent and deeply, profoundly wrong. Eleanor felt rooted to her seat, a primal fear holding her captive. Don't engage. Don't draw attention. Be like the other passengers, silent, still, waiting. But the humming continued, weaving itself into the train's low vibration, into the fabric of the silence. It seemed to amplify the carriage's inherent sorrow, focusing it into a sharp point aimed directly at Eleanor's own grief. The girl took a single, silent step forward, then another, moving slowly down the aisle, still humming, still facing away from Eleanor. She seemed to glide rather than walk, her feet making no sound on the grimy floor. As she drew level with the slumped figure across the aisle from Eleanor, the humming stopped. The girl paused, head still tilted towards the window. The silence stretched, thick and expectant. Eleanor held her breath, watching, every muscle tensed. Then the girl spoke, her voice soft, clear, yet devoid of inflection, like porcelain shards falling onto stone. "Did you lose someone too?" She didn't turn. The question hung in the dead air, directed at the black window or perhaps at the slumped figure. Or perhaps, Eleanor thought with a sickening lurch in her stomach, it was meant for her after all. Before Eleanor could react, could even draw breath to answer the terrifyingly perceptive question, the girl dissolved. Not vanished instantly, but seemed to fray at the edges, her form becoming indistinct, like smoke caught in a draft. Within seconds she was gone, leaving only the lingering echo of her off-key tune and the chilling weight of her question hanging in the oppressive air. Lillipad. Another name surfaced, unbidden. Eleanor shuddered violently, pulling her coat tighter. The carriage felt colder now, the silence heavier. The slumped figures remained oblivious, locked in their private stillness. The train hummed onward through the blackness. She was trapped on a conveyance crewed by skeletal conductors and haunted by spectral children, surrounded by passengers who might be dead or worse, heading towards a destination defined only by regret and loss. She looked towards the front of the carriage, towards the unseen engine, towards the source of the relentless click. Her journey had barely begun, and already the path ahead felt impossibly dark, paved with tailored horrors and the ghosts of her own making. The indigo ticket had promised a way to the other side, but it hadn't mentioned the toll extracted along the way. And Eleanor was beginning to understand with chilling certainty that the fare was far more than she could afford. The cold between breaths wasn't just in the air, it was settling inside her. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Rust. The echo of the girl's voice, "Did you lose someone too?" clung to the cold air long after her translucent form dissolved. Eleanor sat rigid, hands clenched into fists on her lap, knuckles white. Lillipad. The name felt like a shard of ice pressed against her mind. Was the child a fellow passenger trapped in memory or something else? A lure. A manifestation of the train's insidious intelligence. She forced herself to breathe, slow and deliberate, mimicking the calming exercises her therapist had taught her, though the techniques felt flimsy against the oppressive reality of the carriage. The low hum of the train was a constant, invasive presence, vibrating through the seat, up her spine, into the base of her skull. It felt like the carriage itself was breathing, slow and diseased. The sickly yellow-green light from the overhead spheres pulsed, casting slow-moving shadows that writhed like living things. Eleanor scanned the other passengers again. The slumped figure across the aisle, hidden beneath the wide-brimmed hat, hadn't moved. Further down, others remained frozen in their seats, islands of stillness in the humming gloom. Were they aware of her, of the ghostly child, or were they locked in their own private journeys towards their own personalized hells? The faint whispering returned, seeming to emanate from the pitted metal walls, from the rust-streaked window frames. Sibilant sounds like sand scouring metal just below the threshold of understanding. It wasn't directed at her necessarily, but it filled the space, a constant subliminal pressure. Eleanor tried to block it out, focusing instead on the tangible, the cold velvet beneath her fingers, the damp chill clinging to her coat. Then she saw them again. The threads, coalescing near the ceiling directly above her aisle seat. Dark, shimmering lines spun from dust and shadow, weaving intricate patterns against the grimy metal. Eleanor held her breath, unable to look away, bracing for another assault of memory. The threads tightened, solidified. An image formed, clearer this time, cruelly specific. Her own kitchen table bathed in the harsh morning light of that final day. Maya sat opposite, pushing cereal around her bowl, refusing to meet Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor heard her own voice, sharp with impatience, fueled by lack of sleep and mounting frustration over Maya's recent sullenness. "Just hurry up, Maya, we're going to be late, again." Maya's mumbled reply lost now. Eleanor's dismissive wave. "Whatever, just eat." The look on Maya's face then, not sullenness, but a deep, confusing hurt. A look Eleanor hadn't understood until it was far too late. The image dissolved back into swirling dust. Eleanor gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth, the phantom taste of bile rising in her throat. The regret weaver. It didn't just show memories, it weaponized them, selecting the moments that cut deepest, the failures that festered. It wasn't just observation, it felt like judgment. A sudden, jarring shudder ran through the carriage floor, accompanied by a low, grinding screech from somewhere beneath them. It sounded like immense, rusted gears protesting movement. The steady hum faltered for a second, replaced by a discordant groan before settling back into its rhythm. The train hadn't stopped, hadn't even slowed, but something had shifted. A change in the track, or something else entirely. Eleanor forced her gaze away from the lingering dust motes, focusing on the slumped figure across the aisle. Had it moved? She couldn't be certain. The wide-brimmed hat still concealed its face, the heavy coat still draped around its form. But was the head tilted slightly more towards her now? Was that a fold in the fabric near the shoulder that hadn't been there before? Paranoia gnawed at her. In this place, stillness felt as threatening as movement. Without warning, the phosphorescent spheres overhead flickered violently. Once, twice, then plunged the carriage into absolute, suffocating blackness. A disoriented cry escaped Eleanor's lips. The darkness was total, pressing against her eyes. In that silent, sightless void, she heard it, a distinct sound from nearby. A wet, dragging scrape, like something heavy and sodden being pulled across the grimy floor. It seemed to come from the direction of the figure across the aisle. Just as quickly as it died, the light returned, sputtering back to its weak, pulsing state. Eleanor blinked, spots dancing in her vision. Everything looked the same. The slumped figure hadn't moved, or had it resettled during the blackout. The whispering static seemed louder now, closer. Then she saw it. Glistening darkly on the floor, originating from beneath the seat across the aisle where the figure sat, was a thin trail. Dark, viscous, like oil slick mixed with something thicker, something organic. It snaked across the narrow aisle, disappearing beneath Eleanor's own seat. Her stomach churned. What had made that sound? What had left that trail? She stared at the slumped figure, searching for any sign of life, any indication of awareness. Nothing. Just the heavy clothes, the concealing hat, the unnerving stillness. Click. The sound was sharp, metallic, echoing distinctly from the connecting door at the far end of the carriage. Closer this time. Much closer. Mordecai Grimstone. The conductor was moving through the train. An almost palpable wave of cold authority washed through the carriage, a pressure that made the air feel heavy, charged with unseen rules and inevitable judgment. Was he coming this way? Did he know about the trail? Did he care? Fear warred with a desperate need for information. She was trapped, hurtling towards an unknown fate, surrounded by silent figures and haunted by spectral entities. Any clue, any piece of understanding felt vital. That trail, it was tangible evidence of something. Something happening outside the realm of ghosts and grief-induced hallucinations. Ignoring it felt like accepting passive victimhood. Hesitantly, heart pounding, Eleanor leaned forward. She kept her body angled away from the slumped figure, acutely aware of its silent presence. She peered down at the glistening trail where it disappeared beneath her seat, careful not to touch it. The metallic, decaying fruit smell was stronger near the floor. What could have possibly? The train lurched. Not the earlier shudder, but a violent, unexpected bump, as if hitting a massive obstruction on the track. The force threw Eleanor sideways, her hand slamming against the cold window pane beside her. For a single, disorienting second, the window wasn't black. It flickered, showing not the carriage interior but an impossible vista. A vast, churning ocean of black water under a sky the color of a deep bruise. No land in sight. Just endless, hostile waves reaching towards the glass before the view snapped back to impenetrable darkness. Eleanor gasped, scrambling to regain her balance, her mind reeling from the sudden glimpse of that terrifying seascape. Was that the lost sea from Maya's poetry book? Was the train traveling through it? As she pushed herself upright, her searching hand, scrabbling for purchase on the floor beneath her seat, brushed against something solid, hidden in the deep shadow near the source of the dark trail. It wasn't metal. It wasn't upholstery. It was cold, hard, and unmistakably smooth, with a subtle curve. Bone! Eleanor snatched her hand back as if burned, a choked cry escaping her lips. She stared into the darkness under her seat, her eyes wide with horror. Something was under there. Something connected to the figure across the aisle, connected to the dark, viscous trail, and it felt chillingly like a piece of a skeleton. Was the slumped figure assembling something? Or was it shedding parts? The train hummed on, pulling her deeper into its nightmare logic, leaving her trembling on the edge of a horrifying discovery. Chapter 4: What Sleeps Across the Aisle. Revulsion shot through Eleanor, cold and electric. She snatched her hand back from the darkness beneath the seat, scrambling upright so violently she almost cracked her head on the tarnished luggage rack above. Bone. Smooth, hard, undeniable bone. Her skin crawled where it had made contact, a phantom sliminess mingling with the chilling texture. She wiped her hand frantically against her coat, a useless gesture that did nothing to erase the tactile violation. Her gaze snapped across the aisle, locking onto the slumped figure. Every instinct screamed that the bone belonged to it, that beneath the heavy coat and concealing hat, something dreadful was happening or had already happened. Was it decomposing? Reassembling? The viscous trail glistening on the floor seemed suddenly more sinister, not just oil or filth, but some hideous byproduct of decay or transformation. The figure remained utterly still. Yet Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that its stillness was deliberate, watchful. Was the hat brim angled fractionally lower? Was the slump of the shoulders subtly different? Or was her terror projecting intention onto inanimate cloth? The carriage hummed, oblivious. The sickly light pulsed, painting the scene in unreliable shades of yellow and green. The whispers seemed to curl closer now, rising from the rust-streaked floor vents, slithering from the cracks in the window seals. They weren't words, not quite, but sibilant fragments coalesced into impressions, piece by piece, cold, waiting, empty, join. The sounds scraped against her sanity, weaving themselves around the hard knot of fear in her stomach. Eleanor pressed herself back against the seat cushion, trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. The memory of the bone under her seat, cold and smooth, was a physical weight in her mind. She visualized it, a femur, a section of spine. The clinical detachment of the thought horrified her almost as much as the object itself. Click. Louder this time. Closer. Coming from the connecting door just beyond the last few rows of slumped passengers at her end of the carriage. A shadow flickered across the aisle further down, impossibly long and thin in the pulsing light. Mordecai Grimstone was near. The temperature in the carriage plummeted. The already invasive chill deepened, becoming sharp, biting. Eleanor could see her breath misting faintly in the air, a transient plume against the gloom. The humming of the train seemed to falter again, strained, as if laboring under an immense weight. A wave of palpable authority rolled down the aisle, a silent command demanding stillness, obedience. Even the whispers seemed to recede slightly, momentarily hushed by the conductor's proximity. Eleanor froze completely. Don't look. Don't breathe. Don't attract attention. She stared fixedly at the grimy floor in front of her, tracking the dark, viscous trail leading from the figure across the aisle to the space beneath her own feet. Should she move? Try to slide down the bench away from the hidden bone? No, any movement might draw his eye, his non-eye, the swirling void beneath his cap. Slow, heavy footsteps echoed on the metal floor, unnaturally distinct in the oppressive silence. Each step was deliberate, measured, the sound of heavy boots on decaying metal. Closer, closer. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut for a second, bracing herself. He was going to stop. He knew about the bone. He knew about her fear. He was coming for her. The footsteps paused, right beside her row. Eleanor held her breath, every nerve screaming. She could feel the cold radiating from him, a tangible pressure inches away. The decaying scent intensified: damp wool, grave dirt, cold iron. She kept her eyes fixed downward, tracing the pattern of grime on the floor, praying for invisibility. A faint rustle of decaying fabric. Then the sharp, final click of the ticket punch, echoing right beside her ear. But it wasn't directed at her. It sounded fractionally further away, towards the aisle, towards the slumped figure. Silence. Had he punched a ticket for the silent passenger? Did they all possess these impossible indigo slips? Or was it something else? A marking, a tally. The footsteps resumed, moving past her row, continuing down the carriage towards the other sealed end. The wave of cold authority receded slightly, the oppressive weight lifting fractionally. Eleanor risked opening her eyes, slowly turning her head just enough to see his retreating back. Mordecai Grimstone moved with a stiff, unnatural gait, his tall, gaunt frame silhouetted against the pulsing light further down. He didn't look back. He seemed utterly indifferent to her presence, to the bone, to the viscous trail staining the floor. His focus was elsewhere, on some unseen schedule, some spectral timetable known only to him. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body trembling with reaction. He was gone, for now, but his passage had changed nothing and everything. His indifference was almost more terrifying than confrontation. It implied that the horrors within the carriage, the spectral child, the weaving threads, the decomposing passenger, the hidden bone, were normal, expected even, part of the designated service on the penumbral transit authority line. Shakily, she looked back at the figure across the aisle. Had its stillness been a reaction to the conductor's presence, just like hers? Or was it truly inert? As the last echo of the conductor's footsteps faded towards the far end of the carriage, the figure shifted. It wasn't a large movement, just a slight slump, a subtle repositioning like a sleeper stirring. But in the context of its absolute previous stillness, it was monumental, shocking. The heavy coat rustled faintly. The wide-brimmed hat tilted downwards another fraction, obscuring even more of whatever lay beneath. Eleanor stared, her blood running cold. It was alive, or animated at least. Aware, possibly. The wet, dragging scrape she'd heard during the blackout, had that been this thing moving, repositioning itself, shedding pieces. The dark trail on the floor seemed to pulse faintly, a barely perceptible shimmer traveling along its length from the figure towards the space beneath Eleanor's seat. The sickly sweet smell of decay intensified, catching in the back of her throat. What was it? A corpse being slowly dismantled by the train's grim energies. A creature constructing itself from scavenged parts. The ambiguity was a torment. Eleanor felt trapped between the spectral horrors, the haunting child, the memory-weaving threads, and this tangible, physical grotesquerie unfolding across the aisle. She needed to move. She couldn't stay seated next to whatever that bone belonged to. The thought of another blackout, of hearing that wet, dragging sound right next to her in the darkness, was unbearable. Carefully, slowly, pushing through the leaden weight of fear, Eleanor began to slide along the bench, away from the aisle, towards the black window pane. Every tiny scrape of her coat against the velvet sounded thunderous in the quiet carriage. She kept her eyes locked on the slumped figure, watching for any reaction, any sign that her movement had registered. The figure remained still. The hat stayed low. But as Eleanor reached the far end of the bench, pressing herself against the cold, unreflecting window, she saw something else. Peeking out from beneath the trailing edge of the heavy coat near the floor was a hand. Or what was left of one. It wasn't flesh and blood. It was bone-white, skeletal fingers curled slightly inward, resting on the grimy floorboards. Dark, stringy remnants of something that might have been sinew clung to the joints. And nestled within the curve of those skeletal fingers, partially obscured, lay another object. Small, dark, glinting faintly in the pulsing light. It looked like another bone fragment, or perhaps a tooth. The figure across the aisle wasn't just decomposing. It seemed to be collecting pieces, assembling something, or perhaps disassembling itself, hoarding the fragments for some unimaginable purpose. Eleanor recoiled from the window, pressing herself back against the cold seat, trapped between the void outside and the unfolding nightmare within. The train hummed its endless, vibrational song, carrying her deeper into a darkness where the line between spectator and participant was rapidly, terrifyingly dissolving. The horrors weren't just passing phenomena anymore. They were sharing her space, leaving pieces of themselves behind, piece by skeletal piece. Chapter 5. The Taste of Bottled Regret. The sight of the skeletal hand clutching a fragment of bone or tooth sent a fresh wave of nausea through Eleanor. She averted her gaze, pressing her cheek against the cold, dead surface of the window pane, willing the image away. It didn't work. The afterimage burned behind her eyelids, bone-white fingers, clinging sinew, the dark glint of the hoarded piece. The slumped figure across the aisle had transformed from a passive object of dread into an active, grotesque mystery. Was it building something? Or cataloging its own disintegration? The carriage hummed, a low, constant thrum that vibrated through the metal frame, through the cold glass against her skin. The sickly yellow-green light pulsed overhead, casting the interior in unreliable, shifting shadows. The faint whispers seemed to have returned, coiling in the stale air, indistinct but insinuating. Gather, keep, until, complete. Eleanor forced herself to look away from the window, scanning the rest of the carriage. The other slumped figures remained motionless in their seats, distant islands of apathy. Had they witnessed similar horrors? Had they long since succumbed to the despair woven into the very fabric of this spectral transit? Or were they simply empty vessels, part of the grim stage dressing? Her mouth was dry, her throat tight with tension. She desperately needed water, a drink, anything to wash away the coppery taste of fear and the phantom scent of decay. As if summoned by the thought, a new sound emerged, distinct from the humming and whispering. A faint clinking, like glass bottles gently jostling against each other. It came from the front of the carriage, near where the conductor had initially appeared. A figure was slowly making its way down the aisle, pushing a small, wheeled cart made of tarnished brass and dark wood. The cart held several rows of glass bottles, each containing a swirling, faintly luminous liquid in shades of murky green, bruised purple, and stagnant gray. The figure pushing the cart was a woman, or the spectral echo of one. She wore the faded, slightly too small uniform of a 1940s usherette or waitress, complete with a stained white apron, and a tilted cap perched precariously on lank, dark hair plastered to her skull. Her face was pale, puffy, and tracked with glistening trails, as if she had been crying ceaselessly for decades. Translucent, shimmering tears welled constantly in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks, leaving damp patches on her uniform collar. They didn't just fall. They seemed to sizzle faintly where they landed on the cart or the floor, leaving tiny scorch marks like acid burns. Doller's Meyer. The name arrived with the same unnerving certainty as the others. She moved slowly, her footsteps shuffling, the cart wheels squeaking mournfully. She didn't make eye contact with the slumped passengers as she passed, keeping her gaze fixed somewhere straight ahead, though her tear-filled eyes seemed unfocused, lost in some private, perpetual sorrow. As she drew nearer to Eleanor's row, the cloying scent of decay lessened slightly, replaced by a different odor, something vaguely medicinal, mixed with stale sugar and bitter herbs. Dolers stopped the cart beside Eleanor's row, directly adjacent to the slumped figure across the aisle. She sniffled, a wet, gulping sound, wiping at her eyes with the back of a stained hand. The tears immediately welled up again. Refreshments. Her voice was thin, watery, lacking any inflection of salesmanship or welcome. It was the monotone of someone reciting a line learned long ago and repeated countless times since, stripped of all meaning. Eleanor stared at the bottles on the cart. They were stoppered with corks sealed with black wax. Handwritten labels, smudged and water-damaged, tear-damaged, bore cryptic names. Essence of missed opportunities, tincture of words unsaid, concentrated second thoughts, bottled regret soda. The liquids inside swirled slowly, emitting faint, colored light that pulsed in counterrhythm to the overhead spheres. What is it? Eleanor managed, her voice raspy. Dolores didn't look at her directly, her gaze still fixed on the middle distance. Sustenance for the journey. Another tear escaped, sizzling faintly as it hit the brass rail of the cart. Helps pass the time. Helps pass the time, or helps deepen the despair. Eleanor eyed the bottle labeled bottled regret soda. Its contents swirled a murky, grayish purple. The name alone was repellent, yet the cloying sweetness in the air, the constant low-level dread, the memory of the bone. It created a desperate thirst, a craving for something, anything, to alter the oppressive reality, even for a moment. "Is there water?" Eleanor asked hopefully. Dolores blinked slowly, tears pooling. Water? She seemed to consider the word as if it were foreign. No water, only this. She gestured vaguely at the bottles with a damp hand. Takes the edge off, or puts it on, depends. She sniffled again. Recommended. Recommended by whom? The Penumbral Transit Authority, Mordecai Grimstone, this weeping phantom herself. Eleanor hesitated. Accepting anything here felt like signing an invisible contract, deepening her entanglement with this nightmare. But the thirst was real, clawing at her throat. And perhaps a sip of something might provide a clue, an insight into the train's nature. Or perhaps it would just poison her. Across the aisle, the slumped figure remained still, seemingly oblivious to the cart, the usherette, the offered refreshments. The skeletal hand still rested near the floor, clutching its prize. "How much?" Eleanor asked, her hand instinctively going to her coat pocket, though she knew she had no currency relevant here. Dolores shook her head slowly, tears tracing paths down her pale cheeks. "No charge." A faint, watery smile touched her lips, making her look even more desolate. "The fare is paid elsewhere. This is complimentary." Complimentary, like the personalized torments woven by the regret weaver, like the spectral child amplifying grief, like the skeletal neighbor hoarding bones. It all felt part of the same horrifying package deal included with her one-way ticket. Against her better judgment, driven by thirst and a sliver of morbid curiosity, Eleanor pointed a trembling finger towards the grayish-purple bottle. "The regret soda." Dolores nodded slowly. With surprising dexterity despite her trembling hands, she uncorked the bottle. The black wax seal crumbled like ash. She poured a small amount of the swirling liquid into a smudged, heavy glass tumbler that seemed to appear from nowhere beneath the cart. The liquid fizzed faintly, releasing a scent like bruised plums and ozone. She offered the glass to Eleanor. Her hand shook, causing the liquid to slosh near the rim. A single tear fell from her cheek and landed directly in the tumbler, dissolving instantly with a barely audible hiss. Eleanor stared at the glass. drinking a phantom's tears mixed with something called regret soda on a ghost train to hell. This was a new low even for her. Yet she took the glass. It felt unnaturally cold, the swirling liquid within radiating a faint chill. She raised it towards her lips, hesitated, then took a tiny sip. The taste was indescribable. Initially sweet like overripe berries, quickly followed by an intense, cloying bitterness that coated her tongue and throat. Then came the aftertaste, metallic like sucking on old pennies, mingled with the distinct flavor of salt. Not sea salt, but the unmistakable taste of tears. Her own, or Dolar's. For a moment nothing happened. Then a wave of profound, bone-deep weariness washed over her. Not physical tiredness, but an exhaustion of the soul. It was followed swiftly by a surge of intense, agonizing regret, sharper and more focused than her baseline grief. It wasn't a memory playing out like with the weaver's threads. It was pure emotion, raw and overwhelming. Regret for every harsh word, every missed chance, every moment of impatience with Maya, amplified 1,000-fold. It clenched her chest, making it hard to breathe. Through the haze of amplified regret, the carriage interior seemed to shift subtly. The shadows deepened, the pulsing light grew dimmer, the whispers intensified, now seeming to carry fragments of her own self-recriminations. Should have listened. Too late. Never forgive. She looked at Dolers, wanting to ask what was happening, but the usherette was already pushing her cart away, shuffling down the aisle, leaving Eleanor alone with the cold glass and the crushing weight of amplified sorrow. Then came the hallucination, or perhaps it wasn't. The slumped figure across the aisle seemed to clarify. The heavy coat and hat remained, but Eleanor perceived, just for a second, the form beneath. Gaunt, emaciated, skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, eyes sunk deep in shadowed sockets, fixed open, staring blankly ahead, and the skeletal hand. It seemed to be carefully, meticulously using the hoarded bone fragment to scrape away remnants of dried flesh from another piece of bone held in its lap. A grotesque act of self-curation or assembly, performed with mindless, repetitive absorption. The vision, or clarification, lasted only a heartbeat before the figure resolved back into its inscrutable, bundled shape. But the image was seared into Eleanor's mind. The regret soda hadn't numbed the pain. It had sharpened it, twisted it, made her senses hyperreceptive to the carriage's inherent despair and the specific horrors around her. It hadn't taken the edge off. It had honed it to a razor's sharpness. Eleanor dropped the glass. It hit the grimy floor with a dull thud, not shattering but rolling slightly, spilling the remaining grayish-purple liquid. The puddle sizzled faintly, like Dolar's tears, eating slightly into the filth coating the floorboards. She pressed her hands to her temples, fighting the overwhelming wave of despair and the lingering taste of tears and regret. The complimentary refreshment was just another instrument of torment on this relentless journey towards the other side, and she had willingly drunk it down. Chapter 6. The Cartography of Scars. The cloying taste of the regret soda lingered, a bitter film coating Eleanor's tongue, amplifying the metallic tang of fear in her mouth. The wave of amplified sorrow receded slightly, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a heightened sensitivity to the carriage's oppressive atmosphere. The whispers seemed clearer now, sharper, laced with her own specific failures and anxieties. The vision of the slumped figure meticulously scraping bone remained burned onto her retinas. She huddled against the cold window pane, trying to distance herself from the center of the aisle, from the memory of Dolores Meyer's tear-stained face, from the grotesque activity hinted at across from her. The train glided onward, its hum a monotonous, vibrational drone that offered no comfort, only a sense of inevitable, grinding progress towards the unknown. How long had she been on this train? Hours, days. Time had become fluid, unreliable. The unchanging blackness outside the windows offered no clues. The pulsing phosphorescent spheres overhead provided light but no sense of diurnal rhythm. It was an eternal, sickly twilight, perfect for nurturing dread. She risked another glance across the aisle. The figure remained slumped, hat low, coat draped. The skeletal hand was still visible, curled near the floor, though the hoarded bone fragment was no longer in sight, perhaps tucked away within the folds of the coat. Had she truly seen it scraping bone? Or was it a hallucination brought on by the toxic refreshment, a projection of her own internal decay onto the silent passenger? She couldn't be sure. Uncertainty was just another tool in this place's arsenal. A new sound intruded, cutting through the humming and whispering. A faint, high-pitched scritch-scritch, rhythmic and persistent, like a fingernail tapping rapidly on glass, but sharper, more metallic. It seemed to come from somewhere above, near the ceiling. Eleanor looked up cautiously. The phosphorescent spheres pulsed. The dust motes hung suspended. The shadow threads of the regret weaver were absent for now. But there, hovering near the tarnished brass fitting of a light sphere further down the carriage, was something else. It wasn't solid exactly. It looked like a cluster of disembodied objects floating together in defiance of gravity. Antique surgical tools, a scalpel, forceps, a bone saw, several gleaming needles, all tarnished, stained with something dark that looked disturbingly like dried blood. They hovered in a loose formation, rotating slowly, catching the pulsing light on their sharp edges. And they were emitting the scritch-scritch sound, though none of the instruments seemed to be actively striking anything. It was the sound of their presence, their energy. The cartographer of scars. The name resonated with cold, clinical dread. As Eleanor watched, frozen between fascination and horror, the cluster of instruments began to drift slowly down the carriage, moving with a chilling, purposeful grace. It navigated around the slumped passengers, seemingly ignoring them, its focus elsewhere. Its focus, Eleanor realized with a sickening lurch, was on her. It stopped directly above her aisle seat, hovering about 6 feet off the floor. The scritch-scritch sound intensified, vibrating in the air around her. The tools rotated, the scalpel glinting, the needles sharp points of reflected light. It felt like being examined, appraised, measured. What did it want? What was it going to do? The scalpel detached itself slightly from the cluster, rotating to point directly at her. Eleanor flinched back against the seat, pressing herself into the cold velvet. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the entity's rhythmic scraping. "Leave me alone," she whispered, the words futile, lost in the carriage's hum. The scalpel didn't move closer physically, but Eleanor felt a sudden, sharp, stinging sensation on the back of her left hand. She cried out, snatching her hand up, expecting to see blood, a cut. There was nothing. No mark, no wound. But the pain lingered, sharp and specific, exactly where she had scraped her knuckles raw trying to save Maya from the churning water, the moment her grip slipped on the splintered dock piling. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and unexpected. It wasn't just physical pain. It was the phantom echo of failure, of the moment everything went wrong, imprinted directly onto her skin. Before she could react further, one of the sharp needles drifted forward from the cluster. It hovered, poised, then darted metaphorically towards her chest. A searing pain lanced through her, deep beneath her ribs, exactly where the weight of guilt always seemed to settle. It wasn't a physical wound, yet it felt devastatingly real, stealing her breath, making her gasp and clutch at her chest. The pain of loss, grief, and self-recrimination, given agonizing physical form. The entity wasn't attacking her body. It was mapping her emotional trauma, carving her psychological scars onto her very nerves. Each phantom wound corresponded to a specific moment of pain, regret, or failure. It was an intimate violation, terrifying in its precision. Another needle targeted her throat, where unspoken words to Maya, apologies never uttered, had lodged themselves for years. A choking constriction, a phantom burning. Then forceps seemed to pinch at her temples, bringing a blinding flash of the memory, the frantic search, the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles, the pitying looks from strangers. Eleanor curled into herself on the seat, trembling, tears streaming down her face, each phantom infliction layering fresh agony onto her already frayed nerves. This was worse than the regret weaver's threads, more direct, more brutal. It bypassed memory and went straight for the raw nerve endings of her soul. The cluster of instruments hovered, the scritch-scritch sound a maddening counterpoint to her choked sobs. It seemed to be observing her reaction, cataloging her pain with cold, detached precision. Then, unexpectedly, help came from the most unlikely source. Across the aisle, the slumped figure moved. Not the subtle shift from before, but a definite, almost violent jerk. The skeletal hand shot out from beneath the coat, not towards Eleanor, but swatting upwards towards the hovering instruments. The movement was clumsy, jerky, like a puppet controlled by unsteady hands, but it was undeniably directed at the cartographer. The cluster of tools instantly reacted, retracting upwards, the scritch-scritch sound becoming agitated, higher-pitched. They darted back several feet, hovering defensively near the ceiling. The slumped figure settled back into its stillness, the skeletal hand retreating back into the shadows of the coat. The intervention, if that's what it was over as quickly as it began. Eleanor stared, bewildered, the phantom pain slowly receding, leaving behind a trembling exhaustion. Had that thing just defended her? Or was it simply reacting possessively to another entity encroaching on its territory, its designated seatmate? The motivation was opaque, but the result was undeniable. The cartographer of scars had retreated. The cluster of instruments hovered near the ceiling for another moment, emitting a final, angry burst of metallic scraping, before drifting slowly back towards the front of the carriage, seemingly abandoning its mapping procedure for now. Eleanor wiped tears from her face with a trembling hand. She looked across the aisle at the silent, slumped figure, Its stillness seemed different now, less inert, more deliberate. It hadn't moved to help her out of altruism, surely. In this place, kindness felt like a foreign currency. Perhaps it simply didn't tolerate rivals, or perhaps its grotesque process, whatever it was, required quiet, required focus, and the cartographer's psychic intrusion was a disturbance. Whatever the reason, she felt a flicker of something other than pure revulsion towards the figure. Not gratitude, certainly not connection, but a grudging acknowledgement of a shared space, a shared opposition to at least one of the train's torments. It was a deeply unsettling thought. She took several deep, shaky breaths, the air still tasting of regret and phantom pain. The train hummed on, indifferent. The journey continued, each encounter peeling back another layer of her defenses, each horror leaving its own unique scar, phantom or otherwise. The cartographer might have retreated, but the map it was creating existed within her now, a painful internal guide to her own landscape of sorrow. And the creature across the aisle, the collector of bones, had just become an even more complex and terrifying part of that landscape. Chapter 7: Platform of Whispered Names. The aftermath of the cartographer's assault left Eleanor raw, psychically flayed. The phantom pains had subsided, but a deep, aching vulnerability remained. She sat huddled against the window, acutely aware of every creak of the carriage, every flicker of the phosphorescent lights, every subtle shift in the oppressive atmosphere. Her brief, bizarre alliance of circumstance with the slumped figure across the aisle offered no comfort, only deepened the sense of pervasive wrongness. What kind of place forced such unsettling alignments? She avoided looking directly at the figure now, knowing it was capable of sudden, jerky movement, of interacting with the spectral entities, made its stillness even more unnerving. It felt like sharing a cage with a predator pretending to sleep. Time continued its meaningless crawl. Eleanor drifted in and out of a state bordering on exhausted stupor, jolted back to alertness by a sudden intensification of the whispers or a flicker in the lights. The regret weaver's threads remained absent. The spectral child lilipad had not reappeared, and Dolar's Myers refreshment cart was long gone. A tense, watchful quiet settled over the carriage, broken only by the incessant hum and the occasional, sibilant sigh of the unseen whispers. Then a definite change occurred. The low hum of the train began to decrease in pitch, slowing almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably. A low, grinding vibration resonated through the floor, different from the usual hum, the sound of brakes being applied, ancient and protesting. The carriage swayed slightly. Were they stopping? Eleanor straightened up, peering towards the black windows, though she knew they would likely reveal nothing. A station. Here, in this void. What could possibly constitute a station on the ghost train network? The train slowed further, the grinding sound intensifying before easing into a long, metallic groan. With a final, gentle shudder that rattled the tarnished fittings, the train glided to a halt. The silence that fell was profound. The omnipresent hum ceased, leaving a ringing void in Eleanor's ears. Only the faint, ever-present whispers remained, seeming to amplify in the stillness, curling like smoke from the vents and seals. For a long moment nothing happened. Eleanor scanned the carriage. The slumped figures remained utterly still, seemingly unaffected by the stop. Even the figure across the aisle was immobile, giving no sign it registered the change. Then, with a sound like stone scraping on stone, the sealed door at the far end of the carriage, the one Mordecai Grimstone patrolled, slid open. It didn't reveal another carriage or the conductor, but an expanse of swirling gray mist, thick and opaque, obscuring whatever lay beyond. The mist pulsed faintly, lit from within by an unseen, diffuse light source, colder and paler than the carriage lights. A profound chill emanated from the opening, carrying the scent of damp earth, cold stone, and something else. Something that smelled like old, forgotten paper. From within the mist, voices began to emerge. Not the indistinct whispers of the carriage, but clearer sounds, overlapping fragments of speech. Names. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of names spoken in hushed, urgent tones, tumbling over each other. Jonathan Miller, Sarah Chen, David Peterson, Maria Garcia, Ben Carter, Emily White, on and on, an endless, mournful litany. Platform wraiths. The thought surfaced instantly. This wasn't a station of brick and mortar, but a confluence point, perhaps a place where the lost gathered or were processed. Eleanor watched, horrified, as tendrils of the gray mist began to creep into the carriage through the open doorway. They slid along the floor like searching fingers, swirling around the bases of the seats. The whispering names grew louder, more insistent, seeming to call out, seeking recognition. A vague shape began to coalesce within the doorway, formed from the swirling mist itself. Amorphous, shifting, vaguely humanoid but lacking distinct features. It pulsed with the pale inner light, radiating an intense cold. A platform wraith, tentatively extending its presence into the train. It drifted slowly down the aisle, its form constantly shifting, shedding droplets of icy condensation that evaporated before hitting the floor. The whispered names swirled around it like a cloak. It seemed drawn towards the slumped passengers. It paused beside the first figure, a man bundled in a worn overcoat. The mist swirled around him, enveloping his lower half. The whispered names intensified, focusing, repeating one name over and over. Arthur Pendleton, Arthur Pendleton, Arthur. The slumped figure remained unresponsive, seemingly impervious. After a moment, the wraith drifted on, leaving the figure untouched but coated in a fine layer of frost that quickly sublimated. It moved to the next passenger, a woman in a feathered hat, and repeated the process. Eleanor Dubois, Eleanor Dubois. Again, no response. The wraith continued its slow, methodical progress down the aisle, testing each silent passenger, calling their name, leaving a fleeting touch of frost behind. Eleanor pressed herself further against the window, trying to will herself invisible. It was approaching her end of the carriage. Soon it would reach the slumped figure across the aisle. What name would it call for that thing? Would it react? The wraith paused beside the figure. The gray mist swirled around its base, obscuring the skeletal hand. The whispered names focused, becoming a sibilant chant. Collector, collector, collector. The figure across the aisle didn't react physically. No sudden jerk, no swatting hand, but Eleanor sensed a change, a subtle tension in its stillness, a focusing of awareness. The air around the figure seemed to crackle faintly, resisting the wraith's encroaching cold. The platform wraith lingered longer here than with the others, the mist swirling more agitatedly, the chanting of collector becoming almost frantic. Then, as if repelled by an unseen force, the mist recoiled sharply. The wraith drifted back into the center of the aisle, its form flickering uncertainly. It seemed confused, thwarted. It turned its attention towards Eleanor. She froze, terror gripping her tighter than the wraith's chill. It drifted closer, the swirling gray mist cool against her skin even from a distance. The chorus of whispered names shifted, focused. Eleanor Vance, Eleanor Vance, Eleanor Vance. The names washed over her, cold and insistent. She could feel the icy tendrils of mist beginning to lap at her boots, trying to envelop her. It wasn't overtly aggressive, but it felt deeply invasive, a siphoning presence seeking connection, seeking purchase. She remembered the description, siphoning warmth and memories, leaving behind shivering, empty husks. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself, trying to project emptiness, trying not to react, not to give the whispers anything to hold onto. Maya, her mind screamed silently, a desperate ward against the encroaching cold. Maya. The mist swirled higher, reaching her knees. The cold intensified, seeping through her coat, chilling her to the bone. The chanting of her name became a deafening roar in her mind. Eleanor Vance. Eleanor Vance. It felt like it was trying to pull her name, her identity, right out of her. Suddenly, a low groan echoed from across the aisle. Not the wraith, but the slumped figure. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated with a strange resonance, cutting through the chanted names. The figure shifted slightly, the skeletal hand twitching beneath the coat. The platform wraith instantly recoiled from Eleanor. The mist pulled back sharply, swirling agitatedly. The chanting of her name faltered, dissolving back into the general murmur of countless names. The wraith hovered uncertainly in the aisle for a moment, its form flickering rapidly, before drifting quickly back towards the open doorway and dissolving into the swirling gray fog outside. The heavy door slid shut with another resonant boom, sealing the carriage once more. The train shuddered, and the low, vibrational hum slowly returned, gradually increasing in pitch as the train began to move again, pulling away from the platform of whispered names. Eleanor gasped for breath, trembling uncontrollably, the profound cold slowly receding, leaving her feeling hollowed out, violated. She stared across the aisle at the figure slumped in its seat. Twice now it had intervened, albeit indirectly. Once against the cartographer, now against the wraith. Why? What was its purpose? Was it protecting its designated seatmate as some sort of territorial imperative? Or was there something else at play? Some factor within the train's grim ecosystem she couldn't comprehend? The figure settled back into its profound stillness, offering no answers. But Eleanor couldn't escape the chilling realization. Her survival on this horrific journey might somehow be entangled with the fate of the grotesque, bone-collecting entity sitting just feet away. It was a terrifying, unwelcome dependency, another layer of dread added to the suffocating atmosphere of the ghost train. Chapter 8: Echoes in the Dining Car. The encounter with the platform wraith left Eleanor shaken. the phantom chill lingering in her bones long after the train pulled away from the station of mist and whispered names. The low hum vibrated through the carriage, a return to the grim normalcy of the journey, yet something felt different. The intervention by the slumped figure, the collector, as the wraith had named it, hung heavy in the air, an unsettling variable in the equation of terror. Was it ally, threat, or simply another unpredictable hazard? She risked glancing over. The collector remained still, hat low, coat concealing its secrets. But Eleanor imagined a subtle tension in its posture, an awareness that hadn't been there before the wraith's intrusion. Or was she projecting her own heightened anxiety onto it? The train glided onward through the unchanging blackness outside the windows. Eleanor felt trapped in a loop of escalating dread, each new horror stripping away another layer of her resilience. The regret soda still left a bitter taste. The phantom sting of the cartographer's tools still echoed on her skin. The cold touch of the wraith lingered in her memory. And always the image of Maya, the driving force behind this insane journey, flickered at the edges of her consciousness, a beacon of hope, or the ultimate lure towards damnation. A new sound began to permeate the carriage, overlaying the constant hum. Faint at first, then growing clearer. Music. Not the dissonant humming of Lillipad, but the strains of a distant orchestra playing a melancholic waltz. The music was tinny, distorted, as if heard through layers of water or time, yet undeniably present. It seemed to be coming from further down the train, towards the front. Simultaneously, the sealed connecting door at the front of the carriage, the one opposite the end Mordecai Grimstone typically used, slid open with a low groan. It revealed not mist, but another carriage, dimly lit and seemingly more opulent than the decaying passenger car she occupied. Polished dark wood paneling, small table lamps casting pools of warmer, golden light, a stark contrast to the sickly green glow here, and the distinct clink of silverware on china, the source of the music. A dining car. A different figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, not the gaunt conductor or the weeping usherette. This was a stout man in a pristine white chef's uniform, complete with a toque blanche perched high on his head. His face was round, almost cherubic, but his eyes held a disturbing intensity, fixed directly on Eleanor. He smiled, a wide, unnerving grin that didn't reach his eyes, and gestured grandly towards the carriage behind him. "Dinner is served," he announced, his voice booming unnaturally loud in the confined space, cutting through the music. "The finest cuisine this side of the Styx, prepared especially for you." Eleanor stared, wary. After the regret soda, the idea of consuming anything else on this train was horrifying. Yet, the golden light from the dining car looked almost inviting compared to the gloom she endured. The music, though melancholic, was a change from the oppressive hum and whispers. And the chef, his intensity was disturbing, but he didn't immediately radiate the same spectral cold as the other entities. Her stomach growled, a base physical need cutting through the fear. She hadn't eaten since before boarding the train, whenever that was. Could she risk it? What culinary horrors awaited in a dining car run by a chef with predatory eyes on a train bound for the other side? The chef's grin widened. "Don't be shy. Our specialty tonight is manifestation. We serve your deepest desires plated to perfection." Her deepest desires, Maya, safety, an escape from this nightmare. Could food truly offer that? Or was it another trap like Dolar's Meyer's bottled despair? She glanced across at the collector. It remained inert, apparently uninterested in the dinner invitation. Then she looked at the other slumped passengers. None stirred. The invitation seemed solely for her. Hesitantly, driven by a combination of hunger, desperation, and a morbid need to understand every facet of this journey, Eleanor stood up. Her legs felt stiff, unsteady. She took a cautious step towards the open doorway, the orchestral waltz swelling slightly, beckoning her forward. The chef stepped aside, holding the door open with a flourish. As Eleanor crossed the threshold into the dining car, the atmosphere changed instantly. The air was warmer, scented not with decay, but with rich spices, roasting meat and baking bread genuine, hunger-inducing aromas. The car was lavishly appointed, reminiscent of a bygone era of luxury rail travel. Tables were covered in crisp white linen, set with heavy silverware and sparkling crystal glasses. Soft light glowed from shaded lamps on each table. The melancholic waltz emanated from unseen speakers, filling the space with its sad beauty. It was almost pleasant, dangerously so. The car was mostly empty, save for a few indistinct figures seated alone at distant tables, shrouded in shadow, paying her no attention. The chef gestured towards a small table set for one near the center of the car. "Please," he beamed, his eyes glinting. Eleanor sat down cautiously. The chair was plush velvet, comfortable. The linen tablecloth felt real. The silverware looked solid, heavy. It was a meticulous illusion designed to disarm. "What would you desire tonight?" the chef asked, leaning slightly closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A taste of forgiveness, a morsel of forgotten joy, perhaps reunion." His gaze flickered towards the empty chair opposite Eleanor. The implication was clear, chilling. Could he truly conjure Maya, serve her up as part of a meal? The thought was both monstrous and unbearably tempting. I don't understand," Eleanor stammered. The chef chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "The ingredients are unique, sourced from the passengers' past and present, memories, emotions, life fragments. We waste nothing here." He winked. "Tell me what you crave most. Picture it, taste it in your mind. I will prepare it." Horror warred with a desperate, grief-stricken longing. To taste forgotten joy, to feel forgiveness, to have even a semblance of Maya back just for a moment. It was the ultimate temptation, leveraging her deepest vulnerability. She remembered the regret soda, the amplified despair. This wouldn't be simple. There would be a price. The chef's smile was too wide, his eyes too bright. He wasn't offering solace. He was offering another, more insidious form of torment. I just want some bread," Eleanor said, opting for the simplest, most neutral request she could think of. "And maybe some water." The chef's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of disappointment crossing his round face. "Bread, water, very pedestrian, but as the lady wishes." He snapped his fingers. Almost instantly, a plate appeared before her, bearing a crusty roll still warm, emitting the comforting scent of yeast. Beside it, a crystal goblet filled with clear, still water. It looked completely normal, wholesome even. Suspicious, Eleanor picked up the roll. It felt real, warm, crusty exterior, soft interior. She broke off a tiny piece and hesitantly brought it to her lips. It tasted like bread, good bread, nothing more. Relief washed over her, quickly followed by suspicion. Why the normalcy? Was this a trick? She took a sip of the water. Cold, clear, tasteless, just water. The chef watched her, his smile back in place, but his eyes held a calculating look. "Simple tastes," he commented. "Sometimes the simplest meals carry the most resonance." As Eleanor took another bite of the bread, a sudden, vivid memory flooded her mind. Not a painful one, not this time. It was Maya, maybe 10 years old, laughing, her face dusted with flour, helping Eleanor bake bread in their grandmother's kitchen on a sunny afternoon. The warmth of the sun, the smell of yeast, the uncomplicated joy of that moment, it surged through Eleanor with an intensity that brought tears to her eyes. It was a memory she hadn't thought of in years, buried beneath layers of grief and guilt. The bread wasn't just bread. It was infused with a stolen fragment of happiness, a memory perhaps bartered away by another passenger long ago, now served up to her. It was comforting, yes, but also deeply unsettling. Whose joy was she consuming? She looked at the chef. His smile widened. "Resonance," he repeated softly. "Every dish tells a story, sometimes a happy one, more often." He let the sentence hang, gesturing vaguely towards the shadowy figures at the other tables. He leaned closer again. "But you carry such potent ingredients within you, such powerful regrets, such deep longing. Imagine the feast we could prepare from your pantry." His eyes gleamed with avaricious hunger. "A single memory of your sister's laughter traded for, what? An hour of peace, a glimpse of forgiveness." The temptation was sickeningly strong. The memory evoked by the bread was so warm, so real. What would a dish crafted from her own deepest desires taste like? Would it offer genuine solace, or just a more potent, personalized poison? "No," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you, this is enough." The chef sighed dramatically, straightening up. "A shame, such potential." He lingered for a moment, then gave a curt bow. "Enjoy your simple meal." He turned and walked towards the back of the dining car, disappearing through a swinging door presumably leading to the kitchen, leaving Eleanor alone at the table with the memory-infused bread and the clear, cold water. The melancholic waltz played on. The shadowy figures remained indistinct. Eleanor finished the bread slowly, savoring the borrowed warmth, acutely aware of the transaction, the subtle violation. She drank the water, hoping it was just water. This dining car, with its tempting illusions and predatory chef, was perhaps the most dangerous place on the train yet. It didn't assault with overt horror, but seduced with false promises, offering poisoned comfort food for the soul, crafted from the stolen essence of others. It preyed on hope itself, the most vulnerable part of any grieving heart. Eleanor knew she couldn't stay here. She had to get back to the grim familiarity of her own decaying carriage, back to the silent collector, back to the cold reality of her journey. The comforts offered here were illusions, traps designed to make passengers willingly give up pieces of themselves, piece by precious piece. Chapter 9. The Stowaway's Shadow. Leaving the seductive warmth and deceptive aromas of the dining car felt like stepping back into a cold, gray reality. Eleanor paused in the doorway connecting the two carriages, the shift in atmosphere jarring. Behind her, the melancholic waltz played on, a siren song from a dangerous shore. Ahead lay the familiar gloom of her designated carriage, the sickly yellow-green light, the scent of decay and ozone, the oppressive silence broken only by whispers and the train's low hum. She stepped back into the passenger car, the heavy door sliding shut behind her with a soft thud. The contrast was immediate. The air felt colder, heavier. The hum vibrated more intensely here, a physical presence against her skin. The shadows seemed deeper, concealing unseen watchers. Her gaze immediately sought the figure across the aisle. The collector remained slumped, exactly as she had left it. Had it been aware of her absence? Did it care? Its stillness was absolute, inscrutable. Yet, after its interventions with the cartographer and the wraith, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling of a latent awareness coiled beneath the heavy coat and concealing hat. She returned to her seat by the window, sinking onto the cold velvet. The borrowed warmth from the bread faded quickly, replaced by the carriage's pervasive chill. The memory of Maya baking, so vivid moments ago, now felt distant, tainted by the knowledge of its likely origin, a stolen fragment served up by the predatory chef. What price had the original owner paid for that moment of joy? The train glided onward. Eleanor leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes, exhaustion washing over her. The journey felt endless, a relentless sequence of trials designed to break her spirit before she even reached the other side. What awaited her there? If Station Master Somnus truly crafted personalized hells from regret, her destination would be unimaginable. A flicker of movement near the floor snapped her eyes open. Not the collector, not the dust motes, something else. A shadow, darker than the ambient gloom, detached itself from the deeper darkness beneath the seats opposite her. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't mist either. It was pure, flat blackness, like a piece cut from the void, clinging to the floor and lower wall. It moved with unnatural speed, flowing like liquid ink across the grimy floorboards. It slid beneath the seats, elongated, then pooled in the center aisle before darting towards the back of the carriage. It seemed agitated, searching, its movements quick, frantic, and utterly silent. Eleanor watched, frozen, her breath caught in her throat. What was this new horror? It felt different from the spectral entities, different from the physical grotesquerie of the collector. It felt hunted. As it flowed past her row, the shadow paused. It seemed to ripple, concentrating itself into a denser patch of blackness on the floor directly in front of her. It didn't have eyes, yet she felt an intense, focused attention emanating from it. A wave of cold despair washed over her, sharper and more bitter than the train's ambient sorrow. It felt like pure, distilled hopelessness. The stowaway's shadow. The name imprinted itself on her consciousness, the lingering essence of someone who tried to ride the ghost train without the proper fare, without the weight of accepted fate or profound regret. Someone who died trying to cheat the system. And this was what remained. An envious, desperate patch of nothingness, forever trapped, forever seeking escape or perhaps Replacement. The shadow rippled again, then shot upwards, flattening itself against the wall beside Eleanor's window. It stretched, contorted, mimicking her silhouette with terrifying accuracy. It raised a shadow arm when she unconsciously shifted hers, tilted its shadow head when she moved. It was mocking her, mirroring her existence, highlighting her imprisonment. Then it detached itself from the wall, dropping back to the floor with the same fluid motion. It flowed towards her feet, its cold radiating upwards. Panic seized Eleanor. She scrambled back, pulling her feet up onto the seat, pressing herself against the window. The shadow paused at the edge of the seat, its form seeming to vibrate with frustrated energy. It couldn't touch her directly, perhaps, or maybe it was waiting. It flowed back and forth along the edge of the bench, a predator packing just outside reach, radiating waves of icy despair. Eleanor watched it, horrified. This wasn't like the other encounters. The Weaver, the cartographer, the Wraith, they were agents of the train's torment, purposeful in their cruelty. This shadow felt different. It felt desperate, lost, and profoundly dangerous in its emptiness. It envied her form, her substance, her very existence, however miserable it currently was. Suddenly, the shadow darted away from her seat, flowing rapidly towards the front of the carriage. It stopped near the connecting door to the dining car, pooling near the floor, seeming to listen. Then, it flattened itself against the lower wall, becoming almost invisible against the deep shadows there, as if hiding. Seconds later, the sharp, metallic click echoed from the far end of the carriage. Mordecai Grimstone. His heavy footsteps began their slow, measured progress down the aisle. The wave of cold authority washed through the carriage, the air growing heavy, the whispers momentarily receding. Eleanor held her breath. Would the conductor detect the shadow? Would he react to this anomaly, this remnant of a failed journey? The conductor proceeded down the aisle, his shadowy void face fixed straight ahead, his skeletal hands clasped behind his back. He passed the slumped figures without pause. He passed Eleanor's row without a glance. He passed the spot where the stowaway's shadow hid, pressed flat against the wall. He didn't react. He didn't slow. It was as if the shadow didn't exist to him, or perhaps its punishment was simply to be this, an ignored, impotent fragment of darkness, forever haunting the periphery. Grimstone reached the front of the carriage, near the dining car door where the shadow still lurked. He paused, not because of the shadow, but seemingly as part of his routine. He produced a large, tarnished pocket watch from somewhere within his rotting uniform, flipped open the cover with a skeletal thumb, and peered at it intently, though the watch face was surely invisible within the swirling darkness beneath his cap. Satisfied, he snapped the watch shut and turned, beginning his slow patrol back towards the rear of the train. As the conductor drew level with the spot where the shadow hid, the shadow moved, not aggressively, but with a desperate, fleeting gesture. It flowed rapidly across the floor, directly into the conductor's path, momentarily obscuring the floor beneath his heavy boots. Grimstone stopped mid-stride. He didn't look down. He simply stood there, one foot hovering above the patch of absolute blackness. The temperature in the carriage plummeted further. An arctic stillness descended. Slowly, deliberately, The conductor lowered his boot, not onto the floor beside the shadow, but directly into it. There was no sound, no reaction from the shadow, but Eleanor felt a psychic scream of utter annihilation echo through the carriage. The shadow seemed to dissolve, dissipate under the conductor's heel, absorbed back into the greater darkness from which it came. Erased. Mordecai Grimstone lifted his boot. The floor beneath was empty. The stowaway's shadow was gone. He continued his patrol, his heavy footsteps receding down the aisle, leaving behind an even deeper chill and a profound sense of finality. Eleanor stared at the empty spot on the floor, trembling. She had witnessed an execution, a quiet, indifferent, absolute erasure. The conductor hadn't been punishing the shadow for being there. He had simply stepped on it, like crushing an insignificant insect. It was a terrifying display of the conductor's power and the utter expendability of anything that disrupted the ghost train's grim order, even something as insubstantial as a shadow born of despair. She looked across at the collector. Had it witnessed this? Did it understand the implications? Its slumped form offered no clue, but Eleanor understood. There was no cheating this system, no hiding. The fare would be paid one way or another, and straying from the designated path, trying to exist outside the rules, resulted in swift, silent oblivion. The shadow's fate was a stark warning, echoing louder than any whisper in the cold, humming darkness. Chapter 10. The Engine's Groaning Heart. The indifferent erasure of the stowaway's shadow left a chilling vacancy in the carriage air. It wasn't just the absence of the frantic, dark shape. It was the confirmation of the conductor's absolute, almost casual authority. He wasn't merely an employee of the penumbral transit authority. He was an extension of its implacable will, a force that maintained order through quiet annihilation. Eleanor felt a renewed sense of vulnerability. Her own fare, her grief, her regret, embodied by the indigo ticket, might grant her passage, but it offered no protection. She was subject to the whims of the spectral crew, the predatory environment, and the train's own inscrutable mechanics. The train traveled on, its hum a monotonous backdrop to Eleanor's spiraling thoughts. How much further? What horrors still awaited between carriages, between stations? The glimpses of the other passengers, the weeping usherette, the avaricious chef, the silent collector, suggested a complex, horrifying ecosystem, each entity trapped in its own loop of function and suffering. A low, guttural groan began to overlay the train's steady hum. It wasn't the screech of brakes or the grinding of gears she'd heard before. This was deeper, more organic, like the sound of stressed sinew or tearing muscle on a colossal scale. It seemed to emanate from the very front of the train, from the unseen engine pulling them through the void. The groan repeated, followed by a heavy, rhythmic thump-thump, like a monstrous, diseased heart laboring under immense strain. The entire carriage vibrated sympathetically with each beat. The phosphorescent lights flickered erratically, threatening to plunge them back into darkness. The whispers intensified, swirling with renewed agitation. Something was wrong, not the usual wrongness of the ghost train, but a mechanical failure, a system breaking down. The prospect was terrifying. What happened if the train stopped? Not at a station, but truly broke down, stranded in whatever non-space they traversed. Would they be consumed by the void, attacked by whatever lurked outside the non-reflecting windows? The thump-thump grew louder, heavier. The groaning intensified, sounding like metal under impossible torsion, mixed with something wet and tearing. Dust sifted down from the ceiling panels. A hairline crack appeared in the obsidian-like surface of the window beside Eleanor, spiderwebbing outwards with each shuddering beat. Panic began to ripple through the carriage, even affecting the usually inert passengers. The figure nearest Eleanor, the man in the worn overcoat the Wraith had called Arthur Pendleton, let out a low, rattling moan, his head lolling back against the seat. Further down, another figure began to twitch spasmodically. Across the aisle the collector shifted again, not the subtle movements from before but a more pronounced repositioning. It straightened slightly, its hat tilting upwards just enough for Eleanor to glimpse, for a fraction of a second, the shadowed hollows of empty eye sockets beneath the brim. A low, grating sound like stone grinding on stone issued from its direction. Was it reacting to the engine's distress, or was it something else? The train lurched violently, throwing Eleanor against the cracking window. The thump-thump became a frantic, a rhythmic pounding. The groaning rose to a deafening shriek of tortured metal and something else, something that sounded chillingly like a chorus of strained, painful voices woven into the mechanical agony. Then the connecting door at the very front of the carriage, beyond the dining car entrance, presumably leading towards the engine itself, burst inwards with a deafening crash. It wasn't slid open. It was ripped from its hinges, crumpling like paper. Through the mangled opening, bathed in a hellish red glow, Eleanor saw not machinery, but a pulsating mass of something nightmarishly biomechanical. Fused pipes writhed like entrails, tangled wires sparked erratically against glistening, dark flesh. Pistons pumped in and out of weeping organic orifices, slick with black ichor. And at the center, dimly visible through the crimson haze and noxious fumes, was a colossal, misshapen heart, the source of the frantic pounding, visibly tearing itself apart with each spasming beat. It was a grotesque fusion of furnace and abattoir, engine and organism, the engine's heart. From within this mechanical gore, a figure stumbled backwards into the passenger car, collapsing onto the floor just beyond the ruined doorway. It wasn't spectral. It looked solid, though horrifically mutated. Its body was a patchwork of melted flesh, sparking wires seemingly fused directly into its limbs, and broken gauges embedded in its chest. Steam hissed from ruptures in its skin. It scrabbled weakly at the floor, trying to pull itself away from the pulsating nightmare in the engine compartment, leaving a trail of ichor and sparks. The Fuse Man. Another name, another horror. It's tearing apart. The Fuse Man rasped, its voice distorted by static and pain, sparks flying from its mouth. Can't hold. The train shuddered again, more violently this time. The lights flickered wildly, threatening permanent darkness. The pounding from the engine's heart grew weaker, more ragged, interspersed with wet, tearing sounds. The red glow pulsing from the engine compartment dimmed ominously. This was it, breakdown, annihilation. Suddenly, Mordecai Grimstone appeared, seemingly materializing from the shadows at the rear of the carriage. He moved forward with unnatural speed, gliding down the aisle, his skeletal face a void of implacable purpose. He ignored the panicking passengers, ignored Eleanor, ignored the collapsed fuse man. His focus was entirely on the dying engine. He reached the ruined doorway and stepped through, disappearing into the red haze and noxious fumes without hesitation. For a moment, there was silence, save for the weak, wet fluttering of the dying engine heart. Then a new sound arose from the engine compartment. Not mechanical, not organic. A low, resonant chant in a language Eleanor didn't recognize, guttural and ancient. It was Grimstone's voice, amplified, layered, imbued with chilling power. As he chanted, the red glow within the compartment intensified, pulsing in time with his words. The frantic fluttering of the heart began to steady, to strengthen, finding a new, more deliberate rhythm synchronized with the chant. The groaning lessened, the tearing sound subsided. The conductor wasn't just an enforcer. He was a mechanic of the damned, performing emergency rites on a biomechanical horror. But the stabilization seemed to require fuel. As Grimstone chanted, tendrils of shadow reached out from the engine compartment, not towards the fuse man but snaking down the aisle towards the slumped passengers. One tendril touched Arthur Pendleton. He stiffened, emitting a long, drawn-out sigh, then collapsed fully, utterly inert, a husk. The tendril absorbed something unseen from him, then retracted, pulsing with stolen energy. Another tendril reached for the woman in the feathered hat, Eleanor Dubois. The same process, a sigh, a collapse in absorption. The conductor was sacrificing the passengers, or whatever remained of them, to power his ritual, to mend the dying heart, to keep the train moving. A tendril snaked towards Eleanor's row. She pressed herself back, heart pounding, bracing for the icy touch, the life-draining sigh. But the tendril didn't reach for her. It flowed across the aisle towards the collector. The collector reacted instantly. It surged upright, no longer slumped, revealing a tall, skeletal frame beneath the heavy coat, draped in rags and fused pieces of rusted metal. Its head, a bare skull with glowing embers in its sockets, snapped towards the approaching shadow tendril. It raised its skeletal hand, not swatting, but holding aloft a piece of bone, sharpened to a wicked point, like a ritual dagger. A low growl, like rocks grinding together, emanated from the collector's skeletal jaws. It slashed the bone dagger through the shadow tendril. The tendril recoiled as if struck, dissipating slightly before reforming. It hesitated, seeming to sense the unexpected resistance, the hostile energy radiating from the collector and its bone weapon. Grimstone's chant faltered for a microsecond, the engine heart skipping a beat before resuming its enforced rhythm. The tendril lashed out again, faster this time. The collector met it with another slash, sparks flying where bone met shadow. They were fighting, the skeletal passenger defending itself against the conductor's life-draining ritual. Why was the collector spared before by the wraith and now fighting back? Was it not like the other passengers, not merely a repository of spent life force for the train to consume? Did its strange bone hoarding serve some purpose, grant it some power, some agency denied the others? The struggle was brief. Another tendril lashed out from the engine compartment, faster, thicker. It bypassed the collector's defense, striking it squarely in the chest. The collector staggered back, the embers in its eyes flaring, its grating growl rising in pitch. It didn't collapse like the others, didn't sigh out its essence, but it seemed weakened, diminished, its skeletal frame flickering slightly. Satisfied, the tendrils probing this end of the carriage retracted, having claimed their toll from the other passengers. Grimstone's chant reached a crescendo. The red glow flared blindingly, and the engine heart gave a final, powerful thump that resonated through the entire train. Then the rhythm settled, steadier now, the groaning subsided, replaced by the familiar, low hum, albeit rougher, more labored than before. The red glow faded. Grimstone stepped back through the ruined doorway, his shadowy form unmarked by the ordeal. He surveyed the carriage, his void face sweeping over the newly inert passengers, the weakened collector, the trembling Eleanor, the still-collapsed fuse man. He showed no reaction. He turned, gliding back towards his usual post at the rear, his duty done. The fuse man groaned on the floor, twitching feebly. The collector slowly slumped back into its seat, the embers in its eyes dimming, the bone dagger vanishing back into the folds of its coat. It looked depleted but intact, alive in its own horrific way. Eleanor stared, shaking, trying to process what she had witnessed. The train wasn't just a vehicle. It was a parasitic entity powered by suffering, maintained by ritual, consuming its passengers to fuel its journey. And the collector, it was something else. Not just cargo, not just victim. Something resistant, something other. Her strange, unwilling connection to it felt suddenly even more perilous. Chapter 11. The Conductor's Ledger. The immediate crisis had passed, but the air in the carriage remained thick with the residue of fear and the metallic tang of sacrificed essence. The train's hum was back, though rougher, carrying a dissonant undertone, like a machine barely holding itself together after catastrophic failure. The ruined doorway to the engine compartment gaped open, a dark maw occasionally venting puffs of noxious, faintly red-tinged vapor. The fuse man still lay twitching feebly on the floor nearby, seemingly forgotten. Eleanor watched the collector across the aisle. It had slumped back into its customary pose, but the encounter with the shadow tendrils had clearly taken a toll. Its skeletal frame seemed less substantial beneath the heavy coat, the ambient gloom thicker around it. Yet it had survived. It had fought back, however briefly, against the conductor's power drain. This differentiated it profoundly from the other passengers, who had succumbed like wilting flowers, their life force offered up without resistance. What made the collector different? Its hoarding of bones, its unique designation, or something else inherent to its nature? The carriage felt emptier now. Arthur Pendleton, Eleanor Dubois, and several other previously inert figures were now utterly still, devoid of even the faintest suggestion of presence. They were husks, their spectral energy consumed to keep the engine's heart beating. Their sacrifice bought the train and its remaining occupants more time. Time for what? More torment. Arrival at the final destination. Mordecai Grimstone stood silent and imposing at the rear of the carriage, his back to the passengers, a sentinel guarding the exit that wasn't an exit. His presence felt heavier now, charged with the raw power he had wielded during the ritual. He wasn't just a functionary. He was intrinsically linked to the train's horrific life cycle. A sudden, rasping cough drew Eleanor's attention back to the front. The fuse man was stirring, attempting to push itself up from the floor. Its movements were jerky, hampered by the fused wires and melted flesh. Sparks flew from its joints as it struggled. "Help!" it croaked, its voice thick with static and pain. It extended a hand, wires dangling from scorched fingertips, towards the nearest slumped figure, one of the newly emptied husks. "Need, circuit, boost." It was clearly desperate, perhaps fearing disposal or further torment if it couldn't regain function. But its plea was met with silence. The husks had nothing left to give. The collector remained immobile. And Eleanor, what could she possibly do? Touching that sparking, fused form seemed suicidal. The fuse man slumped back with a groan, sparks sputtering around its head. It seemed resigned, awaiting whatever fate befell malfunctioning components on this train. It was then that Eleanor noticed something else. Amidst the chaos of the engine breakdown and the conductor's ritual, another figure had entered the carriage, unnoticed until now. Hunched near the rear, partially obscured by Grimstone's imposing form, was a small, spectral entity unlike any she had seen before. It looked like an old man, terribly stooped, draped in layers of dusty, ink-stained robes. His face was deeply lined, pale and translucent, with thick spectacles perched on his nose. He clutched a massive, leather-bound ledger to his chest, its cover worn smooth with age and handling. In his other hand he held a quill pen that seemed to drip shadows instead of ink. Quentin Pale, the ink-stained archivist. He peered intently at the ledger, his lips moving silently as he scanned the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. He seemed utterly absorbed in his task, oblivious to the carriage's occupants, even to the conductor standing mere feet away. What was he doing? Recording the events, tallying the spent passengers. Driven by a desperate need for understanding, for any scrap of information that might explain this nightmare, Eleanor found herself moving. Slowly, cautiously, she rose from her seat and began to edge her way towards the back of the carriage, keeping close to the wall, trying not to draw Grimstone's attention. The conductor remained facing away, motionless. Quentin Pale continued his silent reading, muttering spectral calculations under his breath. Eleanor crept closer, straining to see the pages of the ledger. She got close enough to glimpse the script. It wasn't standard text. It was complex, archaic, filled with strange symbols interwoven with names and numbers. Columns listed passenger designations, arrival times measured in some arcane unit, fare status marked with symbols she couldn't decipher, and a final column titled Disposition. Under Arthur Pendleton and Eleanor Dubois, a new entry had just been made in dripping shadow ink. Expended. Engine Sustenance Protocol 7. Her blood ran cold, expended, not departed, not transferred, consumed, used up like fuel. Her gaze flickered down the page, searching for her own name. She found it near the bottom of the current manifest. Eleanor Vance. Arrival, 11th hour confluence. Fare, validated indigo grief regret. Disposition, pending Station Master Somnus contract. Station Master Somnus contract. The destination wasn't just a place. It was governed by a contract, an agreement linked to her specific fare, her specific regrets. The personalized hell wasn't arbitrary, it was contractual. Then she saw the entry directly above hers: collector, arrival, unknown antiquity, fare, unverified self-sustaining loop bone tariff, disposition, permanent resident potential anomaly. Permanent resident, self-sustaining loop, bone tariff. It didn't answer everything, but it confirmed the collector's unique status. It wasn't just passing through. It belonged here, operating under different rules, perhaps paying its way through its grotesque bone hoarding. A potential anomaly. Something the system recognized as unusual, perhaps even problematic. Suddenly, Quentin Pale looked up, his pale eyes fixing on Eleanor through his thick spectacles. He didn't seem surprised or alarmed, merely observant. He dipped his shadow quill into an unseen inkwell and made a tiny notation next to her entry. The symbol looked like an eye. Observation mark. He knew she was reading. Had he allowed it? Before Eleanor could react, Mordecai Grimstone stirred. He didn't turn fully, but his head tilted slightly, the void beneath his cap seeming to focus towards the rear. A silent command passed between him and the archivist. Quentin Pale nodded once, closed the massive ledger with a soft thump, clutched it to his chest, and simply faded. Not dissolved like Lillipad, but became transparent, indistinct, vanishing back into the spectral background noise, leaving only the faint scent of old paper and shadow ink. Grimstone remained still for another moment, then slowly turned, his shadowy face fixed on Eleanor. She froze, trapped between the conductor and the end of the carriage. There was nowhere to run. He didn't move towards her. He simply raised one skeletal hand and pointed a long, bony finger towards her seat near the front. The message was clear: return. Do not interfere. His authority was absolute, unquestionable, especially after witnessing the shadow's erasure and the passenger expenditure. Trembling, Eleanor nodded mutely and began the long walk back up the aisle, past the depleted husks, past the weakened but watchful collector, past the groaning fuse man. She sank back into her seat, her mind reeling from the fragments of information she had gleaned. Contract, expendable passengers, permanent resident, anomaly. It wasn't a full picture, but it provided structure, a horrifying logic to the nightmare. Her fate was tied to Station Master Somnus. The collector operated under different rules, and the train itself fed on its occupants. She glanced at the fuse man, still twitching near the ruined engine doorway. He was damaged goods, unable to perform his function. What was his disposition? Expendable. As if answering her unspoken question, the ruined doorway pulsed with a faint red light. Two thick, metallic tendrils, different from the shadow ones used earlier, snaked out from the engine compartment. They weren't seeking energy. They moved with mechanical precision. They seized the struggling fuse man, ignoring his weak protests and static-filled cries. With surprising strength, the tendrils dragged the fuse man back through the mangled opening into the darkness of the engine compartment. There was a brief, violent burst of sparks, a choked-off scream distorted by static, then silence. The tendrils retracted. The fuse man was gone, recycled, repaired, or simply discarded into the biomechanical furnace. Eleanor shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. Maintenance, repair, passenger sustenance. It was all part of the same brutal, efficient system. The ghost train network wasn't just haunted. It was a predatory machine operating on the currency of suffering and spectral residue, ruthlessly maintained by its implacable conductor and his spectral crew. And her one-way ticket was speeding her directly towards her contracted role within that terrifying economy. Chapter 12, Terminus, the Personalized Shore. The disposal of the fuse man underscored the train's ruthless efficiency. There was no room for malfunction, no tolerance for deviation, unless, perhaps, you were the collector, operating under the strange protection of your anomaly status. Eleanor felt a growing certainty that her own journey, governed by the station master Somnus contract, was rapidly approaching its conclusion. The engine breakdown, the passenger expenditure. It felt like the train marshaling its resources for a final push, a delivery. The carriage settled back into its grim rhythm. The hum of the repaired engine, though rougher, was constant. The whispers curled from the vents. The sickly light pulsed. The remaining husks sat inert. Across the aisle, the collector remained slumped, seemingly recuperating from its confrontation with the shadow tendrils, the embers in its skull sockets burning low. Eleanor found herself watching the collector more closely now. Permanent resident, self-sustaining loop bone tariff, potential anomaly. The words from the conductor's ledger echoed in her mind. This skeletal figure wasn't just a passenger. It was part of the train's fabric, yet somehow distinct. Its bone hoarding wasn't random. It was currency, a tariff that allowed it to persist, perhaps even granting it a measure of agency denied to others. Had its interventions, swatting the cartographer, growling at the wraith, fighting the tendril, been self-preservation? Or something else? A flicker of territoriality over the carriage space, including its unwilling occupant. Time stretched and compressed, marked only by the monotonous hum and the occasional flicker of the lights. Eleanor drifted, suspended between exhaustion and hypervigilance. The encounters blurred together: Lilypad's song, the weaver's threads, Dolar's tears, the cartographer's phantom cuts, the wraith's chill, the chef's temptations, the shadow's erasure, the engine's hungry heart, the archivist's ledger. Each had chipped away at her, testing her, probing her grief, mapping her regrets, preparing her. Then the change began again. The train's rough hum started to slow, the grinding protest of the brakes returning, louder this time, more final. The carriage vibrated heavily, dust shaking loose from the ceiling. The lights flickered more violently, casting strobe-like glimpses of the inert passengers, the watchful collector. This felt different from the stop at the platform of whispered names. This felt like arrival. The train shuddered to a complete halt. The engine hum died, plunging the carriage into a silence even deeper than before. No whispers curled from the vents. No spectral music drifted from the dining car. Just absolute, profound stillness, pregnant with anticipation. Mordecai Grimstone materialized at the front of the carriage, near where the fuse man had been dragged away. He didn't look towards Eleanor. He faced the sealed side door, the one that had never opened during the journey. He raised a skeletal hand. With a deafening screech of tortured metal, the side door ripped open. not sliding but tearing outwards, buckling the carriage wall, revealing the destination. It wasn't mist or void. It was a landscape pulled directly from Eleanor's deepest dread. A shoreline, not sand but black, sucking mud littered with splintered, waterlogged wood, the debris of countless broken docks. Beyond the mud stretched an endless expanse of churning black water, exactly like the terrifying sea she had glimpsed through the window during the lurch. The sky above was a permanent, bruised twilight, starless and oppressive. The air that washed in carried the heavy, metallic scent of stagnant water, decay, and overwhelming sorrow. And standing on the muddy shore, just beyond the ruined doorway, was a figure. At first glance, heartbreakingly, it looked like Maya. Same age as when she drowned, same bright summer dress she wore that day, same dark hair plastered to her forehead by phantom water. She stood small and vulnerable against the vast, hostile seascape. Her face, however, was turned away, looking out at the black waves. Eleanor gasped, her heart clenching with a pain so fierce it stole her breath. Maya, the name was a silent scream. Hope, sharp and treacherous, surged through her, momentarily blinding her to the impossibility, the wrongness of the scene. "Maya," she whispered, taking an involuntary step towards the jagged opening. The figure on the shore slowly turned. The face wasn't Maya's. It was a grotesque mask of sorrow and accusation, composed of swirling water, mud, and reflected grief. Features shifted, sometimes mimicking Maya's, sometimes distorting into monstrous shapes. But the eyes were fixed, burning with cold, ancient intelligence and the weight of Eleanor's own specific guilt. They were eyes that knew everything. Station Master Somnus. "Eleanor Vance," the entity spoke, its voice a chorus of lapping waves, sucking mud, and Maya's remembered laughter twisted into something cold and accusatory. "Your contract is due. Welcome to the shore of your making." It gestured towards the black water. "She waits, always waiting, just beyond your reach, just beyond your grasp." Eleanor looked past the station master, out at the churning water. Faintly visible beneath the dark surface, she saw shapes moving. Pale forms turning slowly in the depths, arms occasionally reaching upwards before being pulled back down. The lost, the drowned. And among them, impossibly, heartbreakingly, she thought she saw a flicker of a familiar summer dress. This was it, her personalized hell. Not fire and brimstone, but an eternal shoreline of regret, forever watching her sister drown, forever just out of reach, governed by an entity wearing her failure as a face. Mordecai Grimstone stepped aside from the doorway, his skeletal hand indicating the path onto the shore. His duty was done, delivery complete. Eleanor stood frozen, caught between the horrors of the train and the tailored despair of the destination. Was this the end? Was this the other side the ticket promised? An eternity of reenacted failure? Then movement across the aisle. The collector stirred. It rose slowly, deliberately from its seat, its full skeletal height imposing even in its weakened state. The embers in its eye sockets flared, brighter now, fixed not on Eleanor, but on the station master standing on the shore. It held the sharpened bone dagger again, its grip tight. It took a step towards the open doorway, its movements stiff but purposeful. A low, grating sound issued from its jaws, directed at the waiting entity. Station Master Somnus turned its shifting, accusatory face towards the collector. "Anomaly," it hissed, the sound like water scouring rock. "Your tariff does not extend here. This contract is not yours to witness." The collector ignored the warning. It took another step, positioning itself between Eleanor and the doorway, partially shielding her from the station master's gaze. It raised the bone dagger slightly, a clear gesture of defiance. Eleanor stared, bewildered. Why? Why was it intervening now at the very end? Was it challenging the station master, protecting its territory, which somehow included her? Or was its permanent resident status somehow tied to disrupting these final transactions? A tense standoff ensued. The skeletal collector radiating defiance, the fluid, accusatory station master emanating contractual authority, Mordecai Grimstone watching silently, impartially from the side. This was the moment, a fracture in the system, an anomaly asserting itself. It wouldn't save her, not truly. Her contract was with Somnus, her hell awaited, but the collector's unexpected defiance offered something else, a sliver of unpredictability in the crushing certainty of damnation, a final, grotesque variable. The choice was still hers. Step out onto the shore, accept the contract, face the eternal reenactment of her deepest regret. Or, what? Stay on the train, but the train served the system. Grimstone would ensure the contract was fulfilled eventually. There was no escape. Unless the anomaly offered a different path, not escape but perhaps transformation, the bone tariff, self-sustaining loop. Could she learn its ways? Could she become something other than expended fuel or a tormented soul fulfilling a contract? Could she become resident anomaly? The thought was terrifying. To embrace the train's horror, to become part of its grotesque ecosystem, perhaps even collecting her own tariff. It meant abandoning the last vestiges of her humanity, her grief-stricken identity. It meant becoming monstrous. But the alternative was the waiting shore, the accusatory face of Somnus, the endless loop of Maya drowning. Eleanor looked from the shifting horror on the shore to the defiant skeletal figure beside her. She looked at the bone dagger it held, an instrument of resistance, a tool of transaction. With a deep, shuddering breath that tasted of ozone and despair, Eleanor made her choice, not towards the shore, not towards Maya's distorted memory. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out a trembling hand towards the collector, not to touch it, but gesturing towards the bone dagger it held. A silent question, a terrifying offer of apprenticeship. The embers in the collector's skull seemed to brighten. The grating sound softened just slightly. It lowered the dagger fractionally, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even acceptance. On the shore, Station Master Somnus let out a furious hiss like steam escaping rock, its form swirling violently. Mordecai Grimstone remained impassive, simply observing. The contract was being contested, deferred by the anomaly's intervention and the passenger's horrifying choice. The train remained stopped, the door gaping open onto the personalized hell she had refused, for now. Eleanor stood beside the skeletal collector, the silence stretching, the future uncertain but irrevocably altered. Her journey to the other side had reached its terminus, but her story within the horrifying ecosystem of the ghost train network, it seemed, was just beginning. The end.